Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the witnesses for your valuable testimony today. Before I get to my questions, Mr. Chairman, I just want to make a couple comments. It's, I think, unfortunate that much of the conversation today is premised on job-killing tax increases that really have nothing to do with infrastructure. And if you look at the last 30 years where we have passed in a bipartisan way infrastructure bills here in the Congress, they've always been predicated on user fees of some sorts, whether it's the federal gas tax, which of course hasn't been raised in 28 years, public-private partnerships, looking at other user fees, for instance, on airports. If you use the airport or use the roads, you're going to pay for it. But instead today, we're talking about a real diversion of the tax code, talking about raising corporate rates to fund infrastructure, changing the stepped-up basis, which would affect my farmers and family-run businesses, changing the estate tax, taxing capital gains. These have never been used to fund infrastructure, but we're having a conversation about it. And so these tax increases are really being used as a justification for infrastructure. And that's concerning to me, particularly when we've never used this before. I can think back, Mr. Chairman, in I think January of 2020, we had a full hearing that Mr. Blumenauer led talking about infrastructure, but never once did we talk about raising corporate rates or taxing capital gains or changing the stepped up basis to fund infrastructure. So it's a real deviation from that, and that's really concerning. And my hope moving forward is if we want to have a bipartisan solution, let's talk about traditional multifaceted approaches to infrastructure. Look at VMT, look at user fees, look at public-private partnerships, look at municipal financing, the traditional way of doing that. And I think you'll find support from myself and others on the Republican side. Let me just talk a little bit about my district, which is really a poster child in Central Illinois for infrastructure, whether it's roads or airports or our rail system, our locks and dams on the Mississippi and Illinois River, our bridges and our transit. You can't drive in my district on Interstate 74 from Peoria to Bloomington or cross the Beardstown Bridge without seeing the need for infrastructure. And we've heard a lot in the discussion today on both sides of the aisle on the need to upgrade and improve our country's infrastructure. But where Congress often gets stuck is how to pay for it. And I think any reasonable person knows that this has to be a multifaceted approach with support from local, state, and federal governments, along with private industry. Partnerships between all of these entities will be necessary and has been the precedent in the past. The Congressional Research Service estimates that both the highway and the mass transit accounts of the Highway Trust Fund are scheduled to be depleted by the fourth quarter of fiscal year 2022. There are many reasons for this. The federal fuel tax that has not been raised in 28 years, fuel economy standards have increased, and not all users pay into the trust fund. Regardless, the bottom line is the Highway Trust Fund is going broke. We need to modernize existing infrastructure related to funding mechanisms in addition to exploring new mechanisms of financing to keep up with infrastructure needs across the country. When it comes to the Highway Trust Fund, my constituents are tired of paying into the fund that has ongoing solvency issues, and the available money isn't going back to fix roads and bridges in their communities. That said, it's important that the next infrastructure package ensures that transportation user fee taxes go into a lockbox and is spent on traditional infrastructure investment. Bridges in Illinois are a great example of where the Highway Trust Fund has failed at its primary purpose. Illinois ranks 5th in the nation with the most structurally deficient bridges. To address the needs of my constituents, I'm reintroducing the Bridge Investment Act, which provides communities guaranteed funding from the Highway Trust Fund to repair and rehabilitate unsafe and crumbling bridges seen across the nation. This is a bipartisan bill, by the way. Our country has a diverse set of infrastructure needs. One size does not fit all, and what works for one state or region may not work for another. As we work to incorporate private investment financing mechanisms in the infrastructure package, I think there's a concern that rural America may be overlooked as their projects are relatively smaller and therefore face more challenges to attract regional support or investment from the private sector. My district is mostly rural with small and medium-sized cities throughout. So this concern really hits home for my constituents. Mr. Moore, my question to you is, according to the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, 71% of the total miles of public roads are in rural America. yet we tend to be overshadowed by the major infrastructure and transportation projects in our large urban cities. Can you talk about what types of financing tools work best in rural America?
Thank you very much for the question. Yeah, rural, it's much easier to think about how to finance projects in big cities, even though they can be hard to build. The problem sort of reversed in rural areas. And many of the tools that we've been talking about, originally private activity bond, TIFIA, tax credits, state infrastructure banks or federal infrastructure banks, properly constructed and prioritized, all can help build projects in rural areas. So can public-private partnerships. It just has to be a structure. It's not like you're going to build a toll road in a rural area that can pay for itself. It's more that you essentially bring the private sector in, they build the facility and operate and maintain the facility for an agreement to be paid over that time from traditional revenue sources. So even if there's no new money, the existing revenue in rural areas can be leveraged in that way because of the savings and innovation you can do more with it. So it's really, all of these tools can be used in rural areas as long as they are structured in such a way to include those rural areas, which I think we all recognize is increasingly important.
I thank the gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentlelady from